Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Addictive Conversations, airing out of the heart of UMass Boston, the RA Workroom. I'm your host, Eriq Gasse, joined by my co-host, Nathan Santerre.
What's going on?
We are also joined by a close friend of the podcast, Janrey Javier from Mass Media's own The Riptide podcast,
Hi.
to lend his perspective.
Hi.
The topic of conversation today, surrounds drug usage and the portrayal of that in the media. We wanted to address a few themes that paint a picture of how the media portrays drug usage, how that impacts the societal perception of drug users, and the truth outside of Hollywood.
So, media portrayal of drug users is a huge topic at this point in time, especially since how personalized media is and media consumption these days. Whereas, if you rewind 20 years, people's perspectives besides their own, which is a very small lens, was really fueled by the news and what they saw on TV, and what they would see is these horrific crimes being done by these horrific people who would dare do drugs, and that made them something else other than as a human, basically. And that kind of fueled this sort of othering where it's the first step is kind of that barrier that's built between you and someone else. And it's kind of fueled by a disgust or kind of something you see that's different and that you not exactly don't like, but see yourself as you're either afraid of that sort of thing or you're not. So this sort of fear was played up hugely for political reasons in order to fuel wars on drugs, that sort of thing, and to get money into campaigns such as Reagan and the Nixon campaigns, where their whole platforms are on, tough on drugs, big crime and punishment, big law of the land people. But now today it's kind of evolved to a certain point where media is now a personalized experience where people have their own individual kind of media where they can interact with other people, but they also filter what they see. So if someone sees something that's negative, and or something that reinforces their beliefs, they're more likely to seek out that sort of information. And when it comes to portraying drug users, if someone's not a drug user, for instance, and they have a preconceived notion of what those people are like and how they act, then they'll just reinforce their thought, and this barrier that really kind of separates drug users from what they see themselves as just regular people. So
I think you bring up a very good point. I think othering is the huge conversation point here. Even just thinking back to conversations we've had, previously in the semester in our own class and our own research, such as the documentary 13th, which is coming to my mind immediately. How cinematographers back in the day would paint out very specific groups of people to be something less than human, to be something of an animal, is largely what drives the motivation to essentially villainize these individuals and make them something that is so far away from what we perceive ourselves to be that we are okay with the treatment that follows that, which is, of course, a lot of things that we hear about on social media now and in our conversations academically, where we see that drug users are being subjected to extremely harsh treatment from the police, treatment from the justice system, and not supported by the healthcare system or the psychiatric and medical processes that have already been established for others. They're not getting the necessary attention from those sources. And it all does just go back to othering, us being able to say, well, these people are less than, and so they don't deserve it. And I think you bring up a great point. Social media is a huge influence on that. Janrey, to segue a little bit into drag you into this conversation, I kind of wanted to ask your opinion, or at least your experience or your perspective on what the media does to society in terms of the way it perceives drug users, or even the way that you may perceive it or how you've grown up.
Well, when you ask that question, I immediately think of the Snapchat advertisements. So when I'm going through Snapchat or those Snapchat stories, you see those advertisements that are vaping advertisements, and it's like don't vape or don't smoke and stuff like that. So automatically, it pushes this persona, this message that these drugs are bad. And I think the media is, at least now, they're doing a lot better in terms of being more inclusive, I guess, of that it's not just focused on a certain group of people now, other than before, where it was very much a problem that it was targeted, especially like very early on, like during like the 1970s. I remember reading this book called The New Jim Crow, and I think the author was Michelle Alexander, and she had touched on this a little bit in that book, and talking about Nixon's campaign and how the media at that time portrayed, when he had proposed this idea of the war on drugs, he proposed the media automatically targeted these certain groups of people, whether it was black, Latino, specifically not non-white people. And so with that, it kind of also created this, even it hits even today, this challenge for these groups of people, in that in a way, again, these new Jim Crow laws and oppressing black people, and kind of just sending them to jail because they have possession of these drugs, or like similar with like slavery, but now it's in a sense of they have an excuse to put these groups of people in jail. And so like it's frustrating because you see on the news, or you just hear that this young adult was found with like a gram of marijuana or cannabis, and he's sentenced to jail for like 10 years or something like that. And that's ridiculous, and I think it's frustrating to see that being held accountable to that extent because of just a small act like that, and even potentially not even purpose fully. It might be by accident, and not knowing the story behind that, but just still using this excuse of a war on drugs to target these groups of people is frustrating. And going back to the social media thing, like I said before, I think it's good now that I think we're at a better place now, that I think more and more people are starting to become more aware of the impact, and how that it's not just black people, it's not just Latino people, or other groups of non-white communities. It's everyone, and kind of taking away that stigma. And I mean, it's different with like everyone, like nationally and even internationally, but slowly breaking down that stigma and that system that was once developed not too long ago too. So
no, I agree with you. It's tough. I think for me, growing up for me, no, I agree with everything that you said. I've seen drugs in a different way from the places that I've been. I grew up in a town, 20 miles north of Boston, fairly affluent, fairly white, and there wasn't a ton of conversations about drugs. It was mostly in like health class and stuff. So when I did start learning about a lot of drug usage and learning about what it was largely through friends and through social media and through the news, seeing things in the morning when I was getting ready for school, and seeing these descriptions of individuals using drugs exactly like you said, like they're going to prison for a very long time. They were caught doing what we would imagine, only heinous criminals could be doing. But then I would talk to my friends and I'd get a very different message, where I would see my friends doing very similar things and my peers doing very similar things, and they weren't caught by the police, so they didn't suffer the same punishment. But I thought to myself, are my friends and my peers really on the same level as these criminals that are made out by the media, or is it a different situation? So growing up, it was always kind of a struggle because I didn't necessarily know where to look for my information. But exactly like you had previously said, and what Nathan had intimated earlier. There's a very specific population that's being affected by a lot of the media portrayals and a lot of the literature on the subject, and it largely is the Black community in America that is stuck with the label of being drug users, being drug addicts, being drug dealers, being fully involved in the system that is in fact not necessarily true when we look at the numbers.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of this, because I feel like I can speak as growing up as like a somewhat like middle class, like a white person, where it's you kind of like are born and melded into this, like under this thin veil of like this kind of this nuclear family for the most part, where it's like you don't really realize, at least for me, I grew up in a very rural area, so it's very like kind of secular, very kind of under this kind of like oh people don't really do that sort of thing, you think of like oh but people don't really do drugs around here, that sort of thing, and then like you realize over as time goes on that kind of like that veil kind of gets pulled back and you're like it's actually kind of surprising how many people you find out like do drugs like cocaine or
it's amazing.
or smoke weed and like all that sort of thing. And I think kind of like segueing kind of back a little bit, we're talking about the police. I think you had talked about that earlier.
Oh yeah.
And kind of mentioned like the what's it called, system, the justice system.
Oh yeah.
But like I feel like that's where it's kind of like the othering you see that at its like height, where it's like it's very easy to build that barrier when you're in a role where you have to treat these people kind of as like basically product. And that kind of stems back to like that whole like new Jim Crow sort of thing, where you have people who's like, oh well, you see people every day. It's like, well, this is a criminal. He has drugs, so he's a criminal. I'm gonna throw him this this thing into the back of my car and bring him to jail, essentially. Where that's easy to build that barrier, because that's kind of the only way you can really live with yourself with that sort of thing, where it really takes a toll on the individual and and on their mindset and their worldview, and it becomes one that they want to believe that they're a good person, so they believe that they're doing good things. And that makes by proxy the person that they're throwing into jail a bad person, because they want to be a good person, puts away the bad person. This is how that builds a barrier between the police and our society and our communities. That kind of drives and separates us in many ways. But yeah, and it's, luckily within social media, the way that with its personalization and individualization, like it can be had this echo chamber we hear all the time effect, but it also can be educating for some people. It can also show you new perspectives, and kind of like, so you can kind of like grow up without that sort of like lens in the world of like, oh, everyone lives this kind of perfect, happy little life. That sort of like not reality TV. That's the opposite of what I want to say. But, the old like family sitcom. Everyone like lives the family sitcom life. Like they're like the Brady's, and everyone like goes and everyone sits in their sleeps in their little beds with little lamps, and like the parents sit in separate beds, and they
and everyone goes.
So everything's happy ever after, but because that's what you think life is when you're young. But some people grow up thinking, no, it's not how that is at all.
No.
Yeah, but even touching on that, that's interesting, because even looking at it as an even bigger picture, and not even considering these groups that have been affected, but also just how we've grown up in this society that has, in a sense, established this this sense of coolness, I guess, with some particular drugs, for example, like weed and like alcohol and stuff like that. So, growing up, I remember like if you weren't smoking weed or if you weren't drinking, then like you weren't cool. And so I mean that's still, again, like as like our people become more and more aware, I think it's a lot better now than it was back then. But still, there's still that expectation, or not really expectation, but just that standard, I guess, that you got to do these things in order to be accepted into the society, in order for you to be considered cool. And so
absolutely.
I'm glad you brought that up too, because it's like we're definitely far past in like today's society, like the reefer madness kind of era of like it's like people really don't know what this is and what it does to you. But I think we also kind of shifted in with marijuana and other drugs like that. It was like you said, it was like to be cool, you gotta like smoke weed or like you gotta do other drugs. And it kind of like has shifted into that what we talked and like read before about drug tourism and kind of like how it's like where it's like, well, now it's like this sort of thing that's different to people, so it's cool and it's fetishized in that sort of way, and it's a part of a lot of people's culture, and that's just like how it's been used for like a long time. Like for example, like the coca leaf was just like used by like the Mayan, the Incans, just to like get through every day basically in the mountains, and it's adapted into its own sort of culture with cannabis specifically, like in the U.S. But like for some other drugs, I feel like it's how it's kind of like related to that sort of thing that we spoke and like read about earlier.
Yeah, I think I don't know if someone mentioned this previously, but there was the Juul cigarette conversation and the alcohol subject kind of relates to this as well. But it's exactly what you said, Janrey, and also to go back to the drug tourism thing, like to be cool or to have this identity of being, like a rebellious but independent youth by doing these certain things. It's interesting because we see a lot of the time that some of the things that are deemed cool are in fact more dangerous than some of the things that we have actually been making illegal or preventing people from using. Like, for example, alcohol for centuries has been used and idolized as kind of this ceremonious substance and something that we cherish and we make part of our culture. But within the last 100 to 150 years, there's been many people who have been documenting the fact that alcohol is in fact extremely toxic for you and does not lead to a lot of good things. And alcoholism being one of them, it's a perfect example of what can happen if you go unchecked with this stuff. Cigarettes as well. It was a huge fad in a few decades ago. Now it's died down a little bit, but Juul has taken its place, and we've seen very recently that it's having somewhat similar effects on people that cigarettes did. So there's a question in my mind as to how we get from idolizing certain substances to vilifying certain other substances. And to me, it seems like it kind of depends on what demographic of people are using the substance the most. That determines which ones are legalized and which ones are kept private. And that can even be exemplified in the cocaine versus crack conversation, where cocaine was seen to be a predominantly white drug, where crack was seen to be a predominantly black person drug. And now we're sitting here and crack users, although cocaine was not legal, crack users get significantly greater sentences and harsher punishments when they're brought to court versus what a cocaine user would. And a lot of the time it was a white person versus a black person in court. So I think it's there are a lot of issues surrounding how we get to different places, and the drug tourism thing I think is something extremely interesting to look at, because it brings up its own issues, like delving into appropriation, but also just respecting other people's cultures, but also viewing how they use their substances and the difference in how we use it, and kind of weighing up, do we see the same outcomes in individuals that use it in a different culture in a different way compared to how we do now. But that conversation, it doesn't seem like is being had at a higher level than where it is right now.
I think it definitely started that way with cannabis, especially because I feel like like alcohol has been like the kind of Western culture drug of choice for like the longest time, and it in fact like is responsible for more deaths than all the other illicit drugs combined. But that also could be just because it's legal, and that has that sort of like advantage over it. But go back to like cannabis, where it's like it's definitely had that sort of drug tourism effect from like you look at, because it came from like South America for the most part. And we didn't exactly for the United States for a long period of time didn't exactly have a great view of people who lived in South America.
Yeah, a little bit. That
like
came up,
go back to the Mexican-American War, and villainizing them, even though we were just marching around in their territory with
Oh yeah.
with troops, and going in, even into like World War II, we brought in a bunch of their workers, just because all of our people were at war, and then we said, oh well, time to go back to where you came from, and it's
Right.
been a whole contentious issue since then. And what we've seen over time, how it's kind of like ingrained itself into American culture, and but there's definitely a kind of a gray line when it comes to like appropriation and that sort of thing, since it's not, it still has that stigma attached to it. I would feel like, especially
yeah.
like obviously in the eyes of the government, it's still federally illegal.
Oh, of course, yes.
So it's still kind of in that. I feel like that's why it has that illegality. You also see that with, say, like peyote. It's another example where that's more of a drug of choice used for like rituals and Native American like rituals and stuff like that, or for like spirit quests and things like that. And but that's also a Schedule 1 drug. So it's kind of like we view these like kind of like the substances used by other cultures as like a something different, and you can see how that like kind of that barrier gets built when it comes to like othering that sort of person, how those laws get put into place to like punish those sort of people, because it's not something different than what we're used to.
Yeah.
People don't like things that are different. They're afraid of things that are different.
Yeah.
That's just how that kind of goes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then a part of it, when you had mentioned that, yeah, Eric, I forgot. Oh shoot, lost my train of thought for a second. But just going into the fact that, oh my bad, I just lost my train of thought.
No, it's okay. I think at the end of the day, there's a lot that goes back to the way that things are portrayed to us, and the educational background of a lot of people is where they get their information from, whether or not it's factual. You grow up and you're very young, and in your formative years, if you're told something is bad, then generally what's going to happen is you will associate bad things with that, regardless of whether or not your rebellious teenage self will be inclined to use something like drugs, regardless of what you were told when you were younger. You will still associate those actions with illegality and criminal activity. And for some people, that's a reason to do it, but for other people, it's a reason to not. And regardless of that fact, it's all coming from the same place, is their educational background and their educational standpoint when they're younger. So to me, it's almost like to solve the problem, we have to start at a younger age in educating students and adolescents about what drug use actually is.
Yeah.
And there's actually a huge difference in what I thought and what I learned about drug use when I was in school versus what is actually true. Being in college has exposed me to a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different people, and through those conversations I've been able to gain my own information and be inclined to do my own research on certain subjects. And that's also a testament to the academics that are here as well, because they've also had their influence on my research into this subject. But what I found, and even just to reference this one article that I have in front of me to illustrate the point, is that the demographic differences in drugs are not actually swinging the way that a lot of people are taught. I think in white America, which is the majority of people, what we're taught is that people of color and subjected identities are in fact the people who carry the most drug usage, when in fact a few researchers, not just these ones, there are several studies doing this, but the one I found is specifically done by McCobb, Morales, and a few other authors that actually found in a study of undergraduate students that Hispanic and white students were actually more likely to report drug use than African American and Asian students. And the white students, when we look at the numbers, actually came out slightly further ahead of Hispanic students in terms of overall use. So to paint the picture of Black people and Asian people and Hispanic people, Latino people, to be the prime culprits of drug use and drug criminality is actually not true. It's actually white people. But I think the systematic racism that is built into the country has allowed white people an off card, and there's less conversations about that type of abuse compared to the others. And so to bring it back, the educational standpoint, if we're able to remove some of the media points where we show drug users constantly as Latino or Black Americans, or Mexicans who live here illegally, and paint a more accurate picture about who those drug users and sellers are, then we can get a more honest conversation about what's actually happening. But it has to start at the bottom, I think, and then slowly it'll work its way to the top once the educated individuals can bring that knowledge to the fore.
Yeah. Sounds.
You feel good? Feel good about that one? Yeah. Did you remember what you were gonna say?
Yeah, but I feel like you ended that very nicely. But I mean, I will say, I think you touched on it a little bit, but just educating the younger generation and people who are just coming up. I think more and more just recognizing that even today, like people with how the media portrays drugs, but then also acknowledging that there are people that do use it like medicinally, and with like cannabis, people do use it medicinally.
Close enough.
Yeah. Also, I don't know what the statistics are with like cocaine or crack. I'm assuming it's probably not medicinal, but at least in terms of cannabis, no, yeah. In terms of cannabis, at least there is that. People do use it to de-stress, and I get that. I talk to some of my other friends who do smoke, and they do use it as a form of de-stress, because there's a lot of their anxiety that comes from their life, or just stress. It's a way to escape, and I get that. But then also, with that being said, acknowledging that the harmful effects of that potentially cannabis has, and all these other drugs too, and just really educating the younger generation in these consequences if they do decide to partake in these drugs.
Well, and I have a question for both of you. Oh God, I don't want to lose my train of thought. What was that point you brought up about? So in terms of medicinal drug use and microdosing in certain instances, do we foresee, if we were able to legalize certain substances, or at least allow medicinal microdosing of certain things, we can use cannabis, for example, legalizing the use of cannabis to treat things like anxiety disorders or arthritis or several other conditions. Do we see the stigmatization of those substances decreasing, or do we see a longer process to get rid of that? Because in my own opinion, I see the legalization process of certain types of drugs being a longer process to destigmatize than would be ideal, because I think people hold long-term opinions about these things, and they've grown up over years, if we're speaking about like older generations, with a certain message about certain substances such as cannabis, or we see opioids being able to be treated with other opioids like buprenorphine or methadone, or even heroin assisted treatment, where we literally use heroin to treat heroin addicted individuals. I still see that being a stigmatized thing, even if we did legalize it. But I want to know what your opinions are on the matter.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like there's definitely a decrease in stigmatization for cannabis. You see it's being legalized.
Like modern,
many states.
That's true.
A couple, the past few years, and I feel like it's gonna carry over to other drugs as well. Whether or not I agree with it, but there's kind of coming down the pipeline, people are trying to push for legalizing mushrooms for medicinal use.
Oh yeah.
For it helps with PTSD, I believe.
Yeah.
That's what the use for that is. But I mean, personally, I feel like the first step for all this is there needs to be definitely decriminalization for most of these drugs.
Oh yeah.
Because I feel like that's where the government should start, where it's spending less money on locking people away, and more money treating people who, if they are addicted, because in treating that addiction, and if they're not, then it's okay, well then have a good day, sir.
Yeah.
that sort of thing. But I feel like there definitely needs to be an not like an illegality to it, but a certain it needs to be illegal for like because there's some drugs that are just
Yeah.
dangerous to yourself,
No, that is
and
true,
the government
yeah.
might want, just like they wouldn't let you eat food that's gonna kill you,
Right.
like that's poisoned with E. coli. Like it's some of these drugs are just dangerous, like
There needs to be some
for
regulation.
your health.
Yeah.
So there needs to be some governmental regulation,
Mhm.
whereas you're not making the regular. Because once drugs are legal, then much more people use them,
Mhm.
and that leads to much more deaths of people using them.
Yeah.
That's just how
Yeah.
because availability is just it's just supply and demand right there. You see that with alcohol. That's why alcohol trumps every other drug when it comes to fatalities
Mhm.
because
Right.
it's legal and everyone has access to it.
Yeah.
So I feel like there definitely needs to be a they definitely be decriminalized because I feel like drug use itself isn't really what harms the individual, where it's more of a drug addiction because not all drugs, make you addicted like just from a one-time use. It's that repeated use
Mhm.
that changes that brain chemistry. So I feel like from then you could have people who are trained to identify people who are addicted. If they want to solve that problem, you put money into like treating into like
Yeah.
rehab facilities and different sorts of treatments. May that be like heroin vaccines or heroin assisted treatment
Oh yeah.
and that sort of thing. And I feel like that's the better way to approach it as a society, rather than kind of legalizing everything
Yeah. Yeah.
and then having, because that's like a big thing. Like I know in Portugal, it's like all drugs are legal. I'm not really for that because it's kind of taking it out of the government's hands. But you still have people who are going to be addicted to these drugs, and it's kind
Yeah.
of just taking like a not my problem sort of approach to it, where it's like the government should have a vested interest in the health of its governing body. So
Oh
I
yeah.
feel,
That is
and
true.
it has an interest to protect them from addiction. I feel like
Yeah.
that's
I
the best way to go.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's a very thin line to walk on in terms of just like legalization with drugs. I think in terms of cannabis, at least, it's a step in the right direction regarding that decriminalization that you touched on. In that now although like again with that big gap between like the generations now versus the generations before, like the boomer generation and everything like that. You have people who like really just are say no to drugs, but then at the same time they don't understand that some people benefit in a way that again it helps them with anxiety or stress, and so taking away that stigma of like these drugs are bad for you, but then also acknowledging that some drugs are actually bad for you, and so walking that thin line of I think in the direction taking the direction that if there are more steps to legalizing particular drugs, doing it in a way that is in the focus or the direction of decriminalizing and dismantling that stigma and that system that had been created prior, that targeted certain groups of people, and rather just giving more people an opportunity to just get away from that stigma that was created before, and that oppressing system that was created before. So, yeah.
It's a fantastic point. Well, I don't know if anyone has anything else they'd like to bring up in terms of the conversation, but we are running on time here. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank Janrey Javier for assisting us today with this conversation.
Oh, yeah.
You've been a fantastic addition to the team, and I look forward to having you back in the future.
Of course.
Nate, would you like to say any parting words for the audience?
Well, I hope you enjoyed listening. This has been the first episode of Addictive Conversations, and stay tuned.
I'd like to thank you for your time, and I hope that you enjoyed this. Tune in next week for another edition of Addictive Conversations, and have a nice, safe, and non-addictive weekend.